Well, welcome everybody to another segment of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck. And of course, as always, some smart talk radio is certainly in your future for the next several minutes. We're going to be talking about a really fascinating new work called Revolution Song, a story of American freedom by Russell Shorto. He is a prolific author indeed, also the author of The Island at the Center of the World. He's also a contributing writer New York Times Magazine. It is an interesting story about our past, but also about how we view it here in the present day, history lesson of sorts, and so much more. Should be an interesting conversation indeed. Russell, how are you, my friend?
Fine, Warner. Thank you very much for having me on.
Well, this is an interesting topic, and I don't want to say that it's complicated. I don't want to overstate it, but in Revolution Song, A Story of American Freedom, what you're really doing is maybe pointing out possibly a different way that we look at our founding and how we view things. Is that right, or am I way off there?
No, I think that's a good read of it. What I tried to do was write a story of the American Revolution, a story of the nation's founding, that is familiar but unfamiliar. That's familiar because it's of course, about battles, and it's about the American colonies versus the home country of Great Britain. But what I really wanted to do was write a story about how it felt from the point of view of a cross-section of people. I mean, America was a diverse place in the 1700s. It's even more diverse now, but it was comprised of rich and poor, of not just English colonists, but Dutch and German and French-speaking colonists. There were, of course, the Native Americans. There were slaves, men and women. I mean, all sorts of people. And we're all so familiar with the story, focusing on the men in their powdered wigs. The leaders who wrote the Constitution and the Declaration and so on. And they're part of that story, of course. But I wanted to get at what it felt like from different angles.
How did you choose? And again, a couple of people, Abraham Yates, New York cobbler who turned politician, George Washington, I think we know who that is, but there are the four others that some may not be as familiar with, and curious as to the perspective and how you chose these particular six out of the literally thousands and thousands that you could have chose from.
Yeah, it's a tough choice. I wanted a range of perspectives. I needed to. This is nonfiction I'm writing, so I needed to have people who not only were real people, but people whose lives are very well documented, so that I could, use all their letters and their memoirs and that sort of thing to construct their lives. I wanted people whose paths crossed, whose stories fit together in some way. I didn't want to tell 5 or 6 different stories. I wanted them all to kind of braid together into one nonfiction narrative that gives kind of a new take on the American Revolution. So I spent about 2 years kind of auditioning people for roles in the book, so to speak. And, they had to be people that fit those different categories. And it was harder, for example, with a slave, to find a slave whose life is... And I wanted all these people... I wanted to tell their stories from birth to death. So there are a lot of people from the period we know a lot about for a few years, but we don't know their whole life. So it was a challenge, for example, to find a slave in the period whose life has enough documentation that I could really flesh it out. But over the course of 2 years, sort of one by one, I settled on what turned out to be 6 people.
So as you did this, I'm curious, did you have a lot of input from others, or was this something you did pretty much as a solo project on your own? And I'm curious how long the list might have been. Did you start trying to find 6, or were you just trying to make sure as many bases were covered as possible?
Well, it's not a scientific process. It could have been 4 or 5 or 6 or 7, but, you want it to be a manageable number. You don't want people to forget who's sort of on the page. And I wanted this array of different... I knew I needed to have one, since slavery is such the big contradiction in the battle for American freedom. I definitely wanted to have someone... I needed to have a slave in there. I knew I wanted to have one founding father, one person who we all know, and eventually, actually, the last one I chose was George Washington, and it sort of occurred to me belatedly that by choosing the most famous figure of the period, that's kind of making a little statement too. It's putting him, we're putting them all on the same level. Everybody is born, everybody has a mother, everybody has a childhood, and so I'm kind of weaving them all together. As to leaning on the other people, sure, I had a lot of, the acknowledgments in the book lists all these people who are experts in one aspect or another of the period. You never do something like this on your own. You're always getting as much help as you can from people who are authorities and getting them, whether it's helping me to choose the people or reading parts of the thing in manuscript, giving their advice about, you might focus on this rather than that. So you're always kind of getting help.
Again, if you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio, our guest today. We are talking about the work called Revolution Song, A Story of American Freedom by Russell Shorto. He's a best-selling author of a previous work called The Island at the Center of the World. He's also a contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine. So, Russell, just from 100,000 feet, what? And again, we'll limit the universe to these six. Through their lens, what did you feel that they shared the view of the country, and as it evolved early on, was common? And then take us, if you would, some of the true disparities and some of the logic behind some of those disparities.
Yeah, I started this thing with the idea that there have been so many books written about the American Revolution, I was not going to be another book to tell you what it all meant. There's so many that do that. I would just tell the story of these lives, and we would watch them unfold and watch them weave together, and that would be enough. That was my objective. But about halfway through, I realized this thing is about something. It's about freedom, which, of course, any book about the American Revolution is bound to be. And then I realized that what was different is we're used to thinking of the American Revolution in terms of freedom as being about political freedom. That's what George Washington was leading the troops in battle for, to win political freedom for the colonies. But it was actually, the revolution was part of this much bigger wave that had been building for more than a century in Europe and in America, about freedom in all kinds of ways. So, for example, one of the people I focus on is a woman named Margaret Coghlan, who was a teenager when the fighting broke out. She was the daughter of a British officer. He, right in New York, when the British are about to invade Manhattan, he is insisting that she marry another British officer whom she hated. And it happens that, to talk about women's freedom or a women's movement at that time would be very anachronistic. That was far in the future. But it was building. And the cutting edge at that moment was this idea of forced marriage. People were writing newspaper articles and plays about the notion that women should not be forced to marry against their will. And that's exactly the position she found herself in. She tried to rebel. Her father insisted. She ends up marrying this guy. He's abusive, and then she ends up leaving him, running away from him. And her life then is basically this tragedy after that, all of it stemming from the fact that it happened in the middle of the revolution and in the middle of this wider struggle for freedom. So that's really the backdrop to the book, and what I hope is a little bit different about it. And by the way, this whole wave of freedom that all these people are caught up in carries right through the revolution into the period of the American nation, and really is the backdrop to all of American history, this continual unfolding, whether it's the Civil War or the Civil Rights Movement or even things like consumer rights. All of these things are kind of continuing this trend of freedom for individuals and protecting it.
As you research this, and as you delved into the lives and the thought process of these people, anything in particular that really, really surprised you, that really sort of threw you for a loop, so to speak? I
think overall, the fact that it's so familiar, that what they were going through is so similar to what we're going through now. even though it was 200 plus years ago, even though they couldn't have dreamed of social media and and jet planes and everything. The struggle over freedom, whatever that meant, and the issues of how they focused it on, once they won their revolution and forged a constitution and a Bill of Rights and focusing on and being willing to fight for freedom of the press and freedom of religion. These hard-won individual freedoms, which they felt that everyone was entitled to. I mean, over the past year, when I had finished writing the book, and suddenly it seems like what I thought was history is now alive. I mean, these issues, we are still debating them in the world today.
How common is this? If you were to go and do a similar history in another country about their own revolution, no matter where it is, Western Hemisphere, Eastern Hemisphere, wherever, do you think you would find similar issues?
It depends on when it takes place. The American Revolution was, I think, truly a watershed moment in human history, in that here is a time when they not only fight for freedom from some foreign power, but they're fighting to set up a system in which individuals have a say in electing their rulers, and if they don't like them, then they can kick them out and bring new ones in. I mean, that was a really stunning transformation, and the fact that it has remained this long is equally stunning. So other countries, I wrote my book, as you referred to it, The Island at the Center of the World. That's about the Dutch founding of the colony at what became New York. The Dutch called it New Amsterdam. And in writing about that, I wrote about the Dutch being a precursor, in a way, to the American Revolution. They rebelled against the Spanish rulers, and they had a number of similar features to their revolution. It was about freedom, and it occurred a century before the American Revolution, and the American revolutionaries actually looked to the Dutch as one of their models.
What kind of reaction are you getting? And again, I know the book has not been out for a long time, but so far, what kind of reaction are you getting from either the cultural observers or historians? What are you hearing out there?
Yeah, you're right. It's only been out 2-3 weeks, but what I'm getting is what people are most reacting to, which is a little bit surprising to me, is the individuals. They want to know more about these lives of these people and how they lived and what was the life of a slave like, or what was the life of a shoemaker in upstate New York like in the 1700s, and how did people like that actively get involved in this brewing political movement. So that's nice, because that's really, in a way, what I wanted to do. Was I wanted to kind of focus the lens a little differently on ordinary people and how they decided that these things are momentous enough that I want to somehow become part of it.
What about your own thinking? You've done a lot of writing. You've been around the block before. As you look back on this, what was the great, big sort of learning revelation or so to speak, watershed moment for you as the researcher and the writer here? How did your opinions change, and how did maybe not necessarily your lens change, but your perspective and thought process of the revolution change? I
have more respect for ordinary people, actually. Their need, their not just willingness, but their need to engage with the world around them. And in most every case of the people that I focus on, what they are most focused on is the world immediately around them, their community, their town. Abraham Yates is this shoemaker who decides he needs to be involved, and he's in Albany, New York, and he wins a place on the city council to be part of things, and then he kind of moves up another rung. And soon the war breaks out, and he's communicating with people like George Washington as they're trying to, figure out how to fend off this British army. So to watch these people and see that ordinary people feel that they can because so many of us these days are jaded and feel like, well, what's the point of voting? What's the point of being involved? It's not really going to make a difference. But to see so many different individual people figure that they have to be involved.
Again, we're with Russell Shorto, prolific author and writes for the New York Times Magazine as well. A brand new work called Revolution Song, a story of American freedom. Russell, is it a history book? Is it a culture book? Is it a philosophical book? Describe it for us.
I write stories. I write nonfiction stories about the past. So yes, it's history in the sense that it's all footnoted, and anybody who questions something that's in there, they can go to the footnotes, they can look it up, and so on. But I really I think that storytelling is our oldest form of communication, our oldest way of making meaning out of our lives. And so I tried to, which is why it was important to me to pick not just an array of people, but an array of people whose lives are well documented, so that I could really construct and kind of get under their skin. What did it feel like to go through, for example, in the case of Abraham Yates, while he's engaging in local politics and then moving toward this national stage, he and his wife, 4 times they make this trip to the local churchyard to bury a newborn child. So you get this sense of, as with political figures in our day, you're carrying on 2 lives at once. You have your public life, and then you have your intimate private life with all of its pains and sufferings and joys. And what I try to do in my books is get at that level, get into under the skin of these people, and really see how they operate.
How did you? Again, George Washington, I'll use him simply because he's the one that is clearly would be the best known to most people. Is what did you find out about Washington and climbing into his world that surprised you, good, bad, or indifferent?
How he constructed himself. I mean, he was someone who was born in this at the gentry level in Virginia. He was his father was a tobacco planter, and his father before him. And so he had some hopes of, rising in society. And then his father dies when he's 11 years old. And suddenly there's no money to send him to England to be educated, which was his expectation. And he really and yet he's left with this ambition, this idea, I'm supposed to be this kind of person. And so he then systematically, in his teenage years, constructs this self. He painstakingly copies out of what was originally a French etiquette manual, 110, he calls them rules of civility, how to live your life, how to move in polite society. Things like when you're sitting with people in company at dinner, and you're eating a pitted fruit, don't spit the pit directly onto the plate. Do it discreetly into your hand. Or how to walk in society with someone who's a person of quality, and to be just a step behind them, but listening attentively to their conversation. So you can see him as a child creating this persona, and then another part of that persona was it's fine to have burning ambition, but you have to have what they called a Roman facade. This face that doesn't show the world what you're thinking, or if you're hurting inside or whatever. And that was famously the way people perceived him.
Well, it is a fascinating work indeed called Revolution Song, a story of American freedom by Russell Shorto, again, a prolific writer for the New York Times Magazine and other works indeed. Russell, how can people not only pick up a copy of the book, but also find out a little bit more about some of the writings you've done in the past?
Sure. Well, I have a website, which is my name, russellshorto.com. The book is generally available, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, local bookstores.
So this interview kind of presupposes what is, again, Freedom Song is out, but what, a Revolution Song rather is out. What's the next workup for you?
I'm turning to the 20th century. I'm writing a book about my grandfather, who I was named after, and in my hometown of Johnstown, Pennsylvania. So it's what's now a Rust Belt town, but then it was a booming steel town. So it's middle America in the middle of the 20th century in that kind of heyday.
Well, we appreciate you sharing your thoughts and appreciate the book. And best of luck to you. And again, when you're done with that work, I would love to have you back on the airways with us again.
Warner, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about it, and it's an honor to do your show.
You bet. Hey, we'll be back with more right after this. So